I asked a stranger to hold me for 1 second. That 1 second changed everything. By morning, I was hiding in a luxury apartment. By afternoon, I learned my father worked for the Russian mob. And by night, I found out the man protecting me was the Irish Mafia boss they all feared. I should have run. Instead, I stayed. And that was the moment my life became a war.
Heels. I was 24 the night I learned that danger and safety can wear almost the same face. I ran out of my father's apartment barefoot, with blood in my mouth and no plan in my head. And for the first 3 blocks, I did not think about tomorrow, or money, heels, or where I would sleep. I thought only about distance. I thought about the sound of Gregor's boots behind me. I thought about surviving the next corner. Chicago in March has a way of getting into your bones, but fear is hotter than winter, heels. And that night, fear carried me farther than hope ever had. My father had been violent for as long as I could remember. That was the plain truth of my childhood. Some children learn piano, some learn to swim, heels. I learned the difference between the sound of a bottle put down gently and a bottle set down hard. I learned how to read footsteps in a hallway. I learned how to keep my shoulders loose so a slap would sting less, heels. I learned how to make myself small without disappearing completely, heels. People talk about abuse as if it begins with one terrible moment, one black eye, one scream loud enough for the neighbors to hear. But in real life, it often begins with smaller thefts. Your confidence, your voice, your right to take up space in a room, heels. By the time the punches come, something inside you has already been trained to apologize for being hit. That night was different only because he went too far, too fast. No warning, no long drunk speech, no table rattling buildup, heels. Just a fist to my face while I was carrying plates from the sink. The world flashed white, ceramic exploded on the floor, and before my body had decided whether to cry or fight or freeze, I was already moving, out the back door, down the rusted stairs, heels, into the alley, into the cold. I did not stop to grab my phone, or shoes, or my ID. The stupid ordinary things people need in order to exist in a city, heels. All I had was thin cotton pajamas, a split lip, and the old animal instinct that had kept me alive in that apartment for years. Run now, count later. I turned onto a wider street because wider streets meant witnesses, heels, and witnesses meant Gregor might hold back for a minute. He cared about image more than he cared about truth. He was one of those men who can beat his daughter in the kitchen and still shake a neighbor's hand the next morning like nothing happened, heels. But halfway down the block, I saw something that did not belong there. A black sedan, clean, silent. Expensive enough to look wrong against that cracked curb and failing streetlight. And leaning against it was a man in a dark overcoat, heels. One hand near his pocket, the other holding a phone, as still as if the wind had forgotten him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair pushed back, the kind of posture that made you think twice before speaking, heels. He looked like someone who had spent a long time teaching the world not to test him. There were tattoos on his neck, climbing up under his ear, not flashy. Not careless, deliberate like everything about him. I crossed the street without thinking, heels. That is the part people never understand later. Why him? Why that car? Why that stranger? The answer is simple, because something in me recognized that if my father feared anything, it would be a man who feared nothing. I grabbed the front of his coat, heels, looked up into a face I could barely process through panic, and I said the first words that came. Please. He did not move right away. His eyes dropped to my split lip, then to my bare feet, then behind me. He lowered the phone, heels. And then, with the slightest hesitation, as if his body had chosen before his mind agreed, he put his arms around me. I still remember the shock of warmth, the clean scent of wool and cold air and something dark underneath, heels. I remember how steady his heartbeat felt against my cheek. I remember that my whole body trembled harder once I realized, for the first time that night, that I might have made it out. Then his posture changed. Not away from me, around me, protective, heels. Controlled. He was looking over my head. I did not turn. I knew who was there. I knew the shape of that silence, the breathing before rage. Gregor had stopped on the other side of the street. I could feel him there. My father, heels, who had ruled my life with his fists, stood maybe 30 feet away and did nothing. The man holding me did not say a word. He didn't need to. There are men who shout to prove they are dangerous. And then there are men who make danger quiet, heels. Whatever Gregor saw in that stranger's face, it was enough. The footsteps backed away, first slowly, then faster, then gone. I pulled back, shivering now that the adrenaline had cracked. Heels. I'm sorry, I said, because I had been taught to apologize for messes and fear and breathing. Who was that? He asked. His voice was low even, not gentle exactly, but careful. My father. The words scraped on the way out. Heels. He studied my face for one beat too long. Do you have anywhere to go? He asked. Not because it was funny, because sometimes humiliation becomes so complete it circles around into absurdity. No. He nodded once, tucked away his phone. Heels. A second man appeared from the shadow near the driver's side, blond, sharp-eyed, quiet in the way security cameras are quiet. He took in my state, the stranger's arms, the empty street, and stored it all without comment. Get in the car, Heels. The man holding me said. I don't know who you are, I said automatically. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Ronan, just that, as if a first name was enough, as if names carried different weight in his world. I looked behind me. No Gregor. Heels. No witnesses. Heels. No future I could picture. Then at the car. Then back at the man whose arms had just made my father retreat. Iris, I said, because if I was getting into a stranger's car in the middle of the night, I wanted at least one honest thing said between us. Heels. The blond man drove. Ronan sat beside me in the back, close enough to feel his heat, far enough that we did not touch. The silence in that car was not awkward. It was measured. Nobody asked for my life story. Nobody offered false comfort. Heels. Nobody said I was safe now, because all three of us knew safety is not a word you hand someone after 10 minutes. It is something you prove over time. Downtown rose around us in glass and steel and reflected light. Heels. We stopped at a building I had passed on buses and never imagined entering. Inside there was no flashy penthouse glamour, just a private elevator, a quiet hallway. Heels. A 7th-floor apartment so clean and neutral it looked like a place designed for temporary lives. Heels. Ronan opened the door and stepped aside. You can stay here tonight, he said. There are clothes in the closet, food in the kitchen. Lock the door if it helps you sleep. Why? I asked. It was the only real question available. Heels. Why would a man like this pick up a bleeding stranger and tuck her into a safe apartment? Why would he involve himself? He looked at me for a long moment, and something unreadable passed through his eyes. Because someone should have. Heels. That answer followed me into the bathroom while I washed blood from my mouth with shaking hands. It followed me into the bed where my body dropped like a stone. It followed me into sleep. When I woke the next morning, Heels, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not empty silence, safe, no television blaring, no glass bottle tapping wood, no air thick with stale liquor and threat. The second thing I noticed was pain. My feet were cut, my cheek was swelling. Heels, my lip had crusted dark. Heels. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself the way you look at a house after a storm, trying to assess what can be repaired and what is finally broken for good. Then I tried the apartment door. It opened easily. Across the hall, Heels, the blond man from the night before was leaning against the wall with his arms folded. He looked exactly as if he had been there the entire time. Good morning, he said. That depends, I muttered. Heels. Do you keep watch over every strange woman your boss brings home? He doesn't bring women home, he said. Not rude, not judgmental, just factual. You are the first exception I've seen. There was no warmth in his face, but there was intelligence. Heels. I'm Cillian. Iris. I know. He said it so dryly that I smiled despite myself. Can I leave? I asked. The doors aren't locked, he said. But I'd suggest shoes first. He looked down at my feet and back up at me, and maybe a plan. Heels. I closed the door again because he was right, and because I hated that he was right. An hour later, Ronan arrived. In daylight, he was somehow more dangerous, not less. Night can romanticize a man. Daylight reveals structure. Heels. He had the face of someone who had learned self-command the hard way. Strong jaw. Dark green eyes that missed very little. The tattoos on his neck were not decoration. They read like history. Heels. He looked at my bruises with a stillness that felt more severe than anger. Gregor disappeared, he said without preamble. Same night. Left his apartment. Hasn't been back. The casual way he said my father's name made my stomach tighten. Heels. How do you know that? His gaze stayed on mine. Because I know who he works for. That was the first crack in the world I thought I understood. I had known Gregor was violent. Heels. I had known he disappeared odd hours and had money that did not match his job history. Heels. I had known strange men sometimes came to the apartment and spoke low in the kitchen while I stayed in my room. But abuse narrows your vision. When someone is hurting you directly, you stop asking where the larger darkness comes from. Heels. You just survive the portion reaching for you. Ronan did not push me that morning. He told me to eat. Told me a friend could bring clothes if I had someone I trusted. Then he left me with that line hanging in the air, feels. I called the only person in my life who had ever felt like family, Soraya, my best friend from the restaurant where I worked evenings. She showed up 40 minutes later carrying a suitcase, 3 sweaters, old jeans, sneakers, feels, and enough righteous anger to power a neighborhood. She hugged me first, hard and long, and then held me out at arm's length to inspect the bruises. I'm going to kill him, she said about Gregor. Get in line, I said, feels, because humor was easier than crying, feels. Soraya took one sweeping look at the apartment, then at Cillian in the hall and whispered, "Tell me right now if you've been rescued by a criminal or adopted by a billionaire. I need to know which version of panic I'm dealing with." From the hallway, feels. Without changing expression, Cillian said, "Both would be inaccurate." Soraya stared at him. "He talks. On special occasions," he said. That got a laugh out of me, the first real one since I ran, and maybe that is how healing begins in real life, feels. Not with a miracle, not with instant trust, but with one laugh your body did not expect to be capable of. Ronan came back that evening. I was in the kitchen drinking water, wearing Soraya's sweatshirt, trying to decide whether gratitude was a trap, feels. He stopped on the opposite side of the counter, the distance between felt intentional like a rule. "Thank you," I said, "for last night. For not asking too much, I almost said for holding me, feels." He looked away for a fraction of a second, and it was such a small thing I might have missed it if I had not spent years studying men for signs of danger. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said. "Maybe not," I answered, "but I still feel it, feels." Something moved in his face then, not softness exactly, more like strain, as if appreciation were a language he had not heard in a long time and did not know how to stand under. Then his phone rang, he answered, listened, and the room changed, feels. It is hard to explain that kind of shift to people who have not seen it. He did not raise his voice. He did not swear. He just became more focused, more dangerous, more distant all at once. When he hung up, he said, "Tomorrow we talk." "Talk about what?" feels. "Everything I should have told you already." Then he left. I did not sleep much that night, feels. The next morning, he returned with a lawyer named Declan Byrne, gray suit, pale eyes. The kind of man who looked as if he had delivered difficult truths for most of his adult life, and could do it over coffee without spilling a drop, feels. Ronan stayed standing by the window while Declan took the chair across from me. "Your father," Ronan said, "is affiliated with the Zakharov organization." I frowned. "What organization?" He did not blink. "The Russian Bratva, Chicago East Side Operations, feels. Collections enforcement, low-level intimidation." The words entered my body like cold water one at a time. Bratva. Mafia. My father. The room stayed the same, and yet nothing in it felt stable anymore. "No," I said first, because denial is a human reflex, feels, and because part of me still wanted Gregor's evil to be ordinary. "Predictable. Domestic." "Yes," Ronan said, and he recognized me that night. "Why?" I asked. That was the question under all the others. Feels. Why would a man like Gregor retreat from a stranger? Ronan held my gaze for a long beat, and for the first time I saw something like reluctance in him. Not fear. Care, as if he would have preferred me to have one more hour before this truth landed, feels. "Because I run the Morgan organization," he said. "West Side." It took me a moment to understand. The Morgan organization, West Side, rival. The building, the safe apartment, the silent bodyguard, the lawyer, the car, the way Gregor had backed off, feels. All the pieces rearranged themselves at once. "You're the head of a crime family," I said. "Yes." "And my father works for your rival." "Yes." "So I'm the enemy's daughter." Something hard flashed in his eyes then, not at me, but at the way I had framed myself. Feels. "You are the daughter of a man who hurt you," he said. "That is the only relationship in this room that matters to me right now." I wish I could say that line made me trust him. It didn't. Feels. Trust does not bloom because a powerful man says the right thing. In the real world, women in vulnerable situations are often harmed by men who sound protective. What that line did was something smaller and more important. It gave me room to breathe. Feels. It reminded me I was not obligated to become a symbol in somebody else's war. That mattered. It still does. I asked them to leave me alone for a while. And to their credit, they did. No speeches, no pressure, no insisting I be calm. Just space. Feels. I cried then, sitting on the couch with my elbows on my knees, because there is a particular grief that comes when you realize your suffering was connected to something larger, uglier, and more systemic than you knew. My father was not just a drunk brute, feels. He was a man shaped by an ecosystem of violence, power, money, and fear. That didn't excuse him. It made him more responsible. Adults make choices. Men who have been hurt can still choose not to become cruel. Heals. That is a lesson I would come to believe fiercely. Pain can explain behavior, but it cannot absolve abuse. By evening, I had more questions than answers. I found Cillian in the hallway and asked where Ronan was. Upstairs. I'll go to him. Heals. That won me the smallest change in Cillian's expression. Approval, maybe, or interest. The upper floor was larger, darker wood, longer windows. A conference table with files spread across it. Declan sat organizing papers. Heals. Ronan stood near the glass, looking down at the city, as if its traffic patterns were something he could solve. When he saw me, the intensity in his face shifted, recalibrated. Is Gregor coming back for me? I asked. Not while you're here, he said. Heals. Is that a promise? I asked. Or a strategic assessment? The corner of his mouth moved. Both. It should have scared me more than it did. A man who could make promises like that and mean them should have sent me running. Heals. But trauma changes the way you measure risk. Heals. Sometimes what feels safest is not what is legally clean or morally simple. Sometimes safety is simply the first place where your body stops bracing. I hated how quickly mine had started to unbrace around Ronan. That frightened me more than his reputation, because dependence can begin in relief long before it becomes love. Heals. The next few days did not unfold like a fairy tale, which is one of the reasons I survived them. Ronan did not shower me with gifts. He did not tell me I was special after 48 hours. He did not try to buy my loyalty with luxury. Instead, Heals, he did something harder and more convincing. He respected my pace. He arranged practical things. A doctor came quietly to examine my face and feet. Heals. A woman from one of his legal teams helped me start the process of replacing my ID and freezing the tiny bank account Gregor had access to. Declan laid out real options in calm, non-dramatic language. A protective order, Heals, though he was honest about its limited use if Gregor had gone underground. Contacting a domestic violence advocate. Setting me up with a therapist who understood trauma and coercive control. Heals. It mattered to me that he did not pretend emotional wounds could be solved by one dramatic rescue. Heals. Healing in real life requires systems, paperwork, witness statements, habits, treatment, boundaries, money, and time. Ronan's world was built on power, yes, but in those days he used power to build structure around me rather than pressure inside me. Heals. That distinction became one of the reasons I stayed. Soraya kept visiting. She brought gossip from the restaurant, cheap pastries, too much perfume, and blunt honesty. You know this is insane, Heals. She told me one afternoon while she sat cross-legged on the couch, and Cillian pretended not to hear from the hall. Yes, and yet somehow this is the first time in years I haven't wanted to kidnap you and move you in with me permanently, Heals. That's because your apartment has mold and no heat. Exactly, she said. This one has surveillance, expensive coffee, and a deeply unsettling Irish man who looks like he could read my tax returns through the wall. Cillian from the hall said, Heals, I'm flattered by your confidence in my range. Heals. She pointed toward the doorway without turning around. See? He's growing on me, and I do not like that. Those small moments mattered because terror cannot occupy every corner of a person forever. Even in crisis, Heals, the nervous system looks for signals that life is wider than danger. A joke, a warm drink, a friend who knows when not to ask too many questions. I began sleeping longer, eating regularly, not because I trusted the world again, Heals, because my body had enough safety to begin repairing itself. Ronan remained controlled, almost to the point of severity. He came and went, took calls behind closed doors, met with Declan for hours. Sometimes I caught fragments, routes, names, payments, Heals. East Side, leak, internal discipline. He never spoke to me like I was fragile. He also never spoke to me as if I belonged to him. For a man used to command, that restraint said a lot. So did the distance he kept. Not aloof distance, deliberate distance. Heals. He opened doors before I reached them, and then stepped back too fast, as if the gesture had slipped out without permission. He watched my bruises heal the way some people watch weather forecasts, with attention sharpened by helplessness. Heals. He looked at my face often, but not like men at bars used to look at me. Not taking, not appraising. More like recording, as though each fading mark was evidence in a case he intended to finish. One night I was in the kitchen long after midnight, Heals, making tea I did not really want. Insomnia still came in waves. Trauma has poor respect for clocks. The apartment was dim and quiet, and I thought I was alone until I sensed him in the doorway. Ronan, no coat, dark sweater, Heals. tattoos disappearing under rolled sleeves. Without the outer armor, he somehow looked both more human and more dangerous. Like the outline had not changed, only the distance had. Heels. He stepped into the kitchen and stopped close enough that I could feel his body heat in the narrow room. Heels. We said nothing at first. The silence between us had changed over the past days. It no longer felt like protocol. It felt charged. He looked at my lip, at the bruise near my cheekbone that had turned from deep purple to a tired yellow. Heels. Then he lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, stopped less than an inch from my face. I felt the warmth of his skin before contact then. He lowered it again. "No one is going to hurt you here," he said. "You make dangerous promises," I replied. Heels. Because nervousness always sharpened into irony in me. His eyes shifted, the smallest opening in a door I had only ever seen closed. "I don't make them lightly." He left before either of us said something we were not ready to hold. Heels. It was only after he was gone that I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from wanting the touch he had denied himself. The next morning, almost casually, he changed the shape of everything. We were upstairs. Declan at the table. Heels. Ronan by the window with coffee in one hand. Heels. He said, "My father was killed 4 years ago." There was no transition into it. No prepared speech. Just the sentence. Raw and flat and heavy. He went on in the same controlled tone. There had been an ambush. Cars blocking the street. Bullets. Heels. His father dying while Ronan held his hand on the pavement. "After that," he said, looking not at me but at some fixed point beyond the glass, "I stopped touching people." The words settled slowly, then all at once. The hesitation the first night. Heels. The distance. The hand in the kitchen. The way Cillian had said I was the first woman Ronan had brought into that building. "But you held me," I said before I could stop myself. He met my eyes then, and what I saw there was not romantic drama. Heels. It was bewilderment, the quiet astonishment of a man whose body had broken one of his oldest rules without consulting him. "I know," he said. "It is one thing to be desired." Heels. "It is another thing to realize you have reached a person where even grief has failed to keep everyone else out." That recognition frightened me because it came with responsibility. Heels. A wounded man's tenderness can become a burden if he expects you to cure him. But Ronan did not place that on me. He didn't tell me I saved him. He didn't turn me into medicine for his loss. Heels. He simply acknowledged the fact that something rare had happened and left it there. That was one of the first moments I understood his feelings could be real without becoming manipulative. By then, pieces of his world had started to sharpen for me. Heels. Not enough to understand operations, enough to understand hierarchy. Cillian was not just security. He was judgment in motion. Declan was not just legal counsel. He was the bridge between brutality and legitimacy. Heels. The man who made consequences look like paperwork, and Ronan was not merely a criminal caricature. He was something more plausible and therefore more frightening. Heels. A disciplined organizer, strategist, a man who understood city contracts, supply chains, leverage, and people's weaknesses. The movies get this wrong. Real power is rarely loud all the time. Most of it wears suits, funds charities, heels. Invests in real estate, knows judges by first name, and lets other people do the shouting. Gregor, I would soon learn, was not made for that kind of power. He was a foot soldier with appetites larger than his judgment. Heels. That became crucial when the next truth surfaced. It happened indirectly at first. Changed air in the upper floor, closed doors, calls that lasted too long, Cillian moving faster, speaking less. I was not invited into the meetings, and I hated that. Heels. Not because I needed to know everything, because secrets had been used against me all my life. In abusive homes, information is currency. Who knows what? Who is told what? Who must ask permission to learn the truth? Heels. I had promised myself that if I survived Gregor, I would never again live passively inside somebody else's hidden world. So on the morning of the third day after Ronan told me about his father, Heels, I went upstairs unannounced and stopped in the conference room doorway. Ronan was at the head of the table. Declan to his right with an open file, Cillian to his left, arms folded, Heels. The three of them looked like a machine that had worked together a long time. "I'm not asking to be protected by ignorance," I said. "If this concerns me, I want to hear it directly." Declan started to object, Heels, but Ronan cut him off without raising his voice. "She stays." Those two words landed differently than they would have in another man's mouth. They did not mean ownership. They meant recognition. Heels. I took the empty chair opposite them and folded my hands in my lap so no one would see they were shaking. Ronan laid it out with precise calm. Gregor had not only worked for the Zakharovs, Heels. He had been selling information from inside their operation to third parties for at least 2 years. Names, route changes, contact numbers, small things individually, enough collectively to get men hurt. He's been skimming and leaking, Declan added. Feels. Not enough to destabilize the entire organization, enough to make himself useful to opportunists. I thought of the unexplained cash, the burner phones. The nights Gregor was sober not from discipline but from nerves. Feels. Betrayal sat on him more naturally than loyalty ever had. What are you going to do? I asked. Ronan did not answer right away. When he finally did, Feels, the man in front of me was not the one who had held me in the street or almost touched my face in the kitchen. He was the strategist. I'm going to hand the information to Zakharov. Your rival, I said. Yes. Why would you help him? Feels. Because it isn't help, Declan said. It's leverage. Zakharov needs to clean his own house. Ronan offers proof. Feels. In return, we get something more valuable than Gregor alive. A ceasefire, I said. A limited understanding, Declan corrected. Temporary, practical, mutually beneficial. I looked at Ronan then, really looked at him, Feels, and understood the second layer beneath the strategy. He could have simply let Gregor remain missing until someone found him. He could have used Gregor against the Zakharovs in quieter ways. He could have made this a pure business move, Feels. Instead, he was choosing the one path that stripped Gregor of protection, status, and hiding places without putting me in the middle of a shooting war. He was solving the problem in the way least likely to leave blood on my doorstep, Feels. I'm not a piece on your board, I said, because I needed that line drawn clearly. Ronan's gaze locked on mine. If you were, he said softly, I wouldn't be losing by doing this. The room went still. Declan became fascinated by the file in front of him. Feels. Cillian's mouth twitched so faintly I might have imagined it, but I heard what Ronan had admitted. Not in poetry, not in confession, in cost. He was telling the truth in the language he trusted most consequence. Something in my chest shifted then, Feels. Dangerous and warm. Love, if it comes honestly, does not usually arrive as violins and certainty. Sometimes it arrives as respect, as being seen clearly by someone powerful who still refuses to reduce you. Feels. As a door being held open instead of a grip closing around your wrist. That afternoon an envelope arrived. No stamp. Hand-delivered by a nervous man who vanished almost as soon as Cillian opened the door. Inside was a note in Gregor's crooked hand. Feels. He wrote that I was being deceived. That Ronan Morgan was using me as a bargaining chip, that I should run before I became collateral in a war I did not understand. The first time I read it, my body reacted before my mind did. Fear, reflexive, Feels, learned over years. Feels. The second time, I heard what was really inside the message. Not concern, panic. A man losing control reaching for the old mechanism. If he could not beat me into obedience, maybe he could frighten me back into it. Feels. Soraya read it over my shoulder and muttered something savage in Arabic. You're not going to believe this, right? She asked. No, I said. Then, after a beat, because I needed to be honest with myself, not because I trust Ronan completely, Feels, because I know Gregor. That distinction mattered. Healing is not blind faith in a new protector. It is learning to trust your own judgment again. Ronan heard about the note within the hour because in his world information moved faster than emotion. Feels. He came to the apartment and stood in the middle of the living room, still as a drawn line. Do you believe him or me? He asked. The question was simple. The stakes under it were not. I looked at him, Feels, at those dark green eyes that had watched me heal with a care he never named. Feels. At the man who had offered resources, not fantasies. Distance, not pressure. I don't believe anyone automatically anymore, I said, but I'm still here. Something in him settled then. Not relief exactly. Decision. He nodded once and left without another word. Only later would I understand that my answer was enough. I had not given him surrender. I had given him agency. That was apparently the one thing he valued in me more than my gratitude or fear. Feels. The meeting with Viktor Zakharov happened 3 days later, and I was not there, which was probably best. Some scenes are more powerful when heard afterward in fragments because the mind assembles them with the correct weight. Feels. The restaurant had no sign outside, private entrance. White tablecloths used mostly as camouflage for conversations the city was not meant to hear. Ronan went in with Declan. Feels. Cillian stayed outside with 2 men who looked less like bodyguards than accountants until you noticed how they stood. Zakharov, I was told, was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, Feels, the kind of man who had survived long enough in his world to understand that rage is most useful when saved. Ronan placed the file on the table. Zakharov opened it. read every page, said very little. At the end, according to Declan, feels. He closed the folder and looked at Ronan for several seconds without blinking. Then he said, "The problem is mine." In that sentence, Gregor was finished. Feels. Not dead yet, perhaps. Not officially, but organizationally dead. Men like Gregor survive by belonging to something larger than themselves. Once that shelter is withdrawn, all their swagger turns to air. Feels. He had sold information to people who could not protect him from the people he betrayed. He had confused proximity to violence with immunity from consequence. It is a common mistake among cruel men. They think fear is a permanent resource. It isn't, feels. They also think the people they hurt will stay small forever. That isn't true either. News of the arrangement moved through the building in careful, indirect ways. A limited cooling of hostilities between the Morgan side and the Zakharovs. Feels. A practical truce. Business, not friendship. And Gregor no longer sheltered. I sat on the edge of the bed in the 7th floor apartment for a long time after Declan told me. Not crying, not smiling. Trying to understand what had happened. Feels. Ronan had taken down the man who had terrorized me for years without coming to me like a hero and asking for praise. He had done it through files, timing, and pressure points. Through systems. Through the same kind of cold intelligence that, feels, in another direction, could ruin a life just as thoroughly as fists. That duality mattered. It is easy to romanticize competence when it protects you. Harder and wiser to remember that power is only moral when governed by restraint. Feels. I went upstairs to find him because I needed an answer that was not strategic. He was alone by the window for once, hands in his pockets, city lights reflected faintly in the glass around him. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Really?" Feels. He turned and looked at me in that full, unsettling way of his. "Because no one ever did it for you," he said. That sentence broke something open in me. Not because it was romantic, because it was true in a way that few things had ever been true. Feels. No one had stepped between me and Gregor when I was a child. No teacher had asked enough questions. No neighbor had called often enough. No family member had chosen discomfort over denial. Abuse thrives in silence, feels, and many people participate in silence because intervention is inconvenient. Ronan, for all his darkness, had not stayed convenient. "That doesn't make what you are disappear," I said quietly. "No," he answered. "It doesn't," feels. "And I'm not going to pretend I understand your world. You shouldn't. But you gave me room to understand my own again." Something softer entered his face then. Just for a second. The smallest fracture in control, feels. Then he did something that stopped my breath. He held out his hand, open up, waiting, not commanding, asking. It would be hard to explain to someone else why that mattered so much. In any ordinary room, a hand offered is a small thing. In that room, feels, with that man, it was a profound act of vulnerability, feels. Not because he was incapable of touching, but because he had told me what touch had cost him. I looked at his hand, at the scars I had not noticed before, at the veins in the stillness, then I placed my hand in his. He closed his fingers around mine slowly, feels, as if every inch of contact required consent from a part of himself that had not spoken in years. His hand was warm, rough, steady. The expression on his face was not triumph or hunger. It was wonder, stripped down and quiet, feels, like he had expected pain and found none. We stood there longer than the moment technically required. Then he said, "Come with me." He took me to the top floor, the real penthouse. The private elevator opened into a wide, feels, dark space of wood and glass and restrained wealth. No gaudy excess, no gold nonsense, feels. Just excellent materials, clean lines, art chosen carefully, books actually read. A kitchen with knives kept sharp, and floor-to-ceiling windows looking over Chicago like the whole city had been laid out to study, feels. It looked less like a gangster's trophy, and more like the home of a man who trusted very little, and therefore selected everything. He poured whiskey into 2 glasses and handed me one. We ended up sitting on the floor by the windows, feels. Backs against the glass because formal furniture felt absurd for the kind of honesty that started opening between us. I told him things I had not said aloud before, feels. About how the restaurant had become my safe place, because the rhythm of orders and dishes and regular customers made life feel measurable. About how Soraya was the closest thing I had to family, feels. About the humiliation of growing up in a house where every object felt borrowed and every expression of self had to be hidden. "I never belonged anywhere," I said, feels. "I learned to survive places." That's not the same thing. He listened without interrupting, not staring at me the whole time, which I appreciated. Some people perform attention like theater, feels. Ronan listened the way serious men listen in courtrooms and operating rooms. Nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. When he fully spoke out about his father again, he did it without embellishment. Ambush, gunshots, asphalt, a hand going limp in his own heels. After that, he said, turning the glass between his fingers, touch felt like loss waiting to happen. And now, I asked, he looked at me. Now it feels like risk. It was the most honest answer possible. Not destiny, not forever risk. Heals. Adults who have lived through violence do not recover by pretending danger vanished. They recover by choosing carefully where risk is worth taking. That truth brought me more peace than any promise of permanence could have. Heals. If I ask again, I said, my voice lower than I meant it to be, would you touch me? He did not answer right away. He set down his glass, lifted his hand. This time he did not stop short. Heals. His fingertips touched my cheek with such care that my eyes closed on instinct. He traced the line near my mouth where the cut had been, not erotically, not even possessively, gently, as if confirming that damage could heal under witness. Heals. Then he rested his forehead against mine, breath warm, eyes close, every muscle in his body taut with restraint. There are moments in life when desire and grief and tenderness all arrive at once and the body cannot separate them. This was one. Iris. Heals, he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth than it did anywhere else. Not decorative. Essential. I kissed him first. Slowly. A question, not a claim. He answered with the same caution, feels then with more certainty once the fact of it had been established. The kiss deepened, but what I remember most is not heat. Feels. It is care. The way he paused every few seconds as if asking again without words. The way his hand stayed open against the side of my face. The way my own body, trained for years to brace, did not brace. Feels. People hear stories like this and want either fantasy or warning, a darkly glamorous rescuer, or a cautionary tale about damaged people running into each other and calling it love. Real life is less neat. Our first intimacy was not a cure. Heals. It was not surrender. It was two adults, both marked by loss in different ways, choosing contact with unusual honesty. We did sleep together that night, but not in the fevered, destructive way stories often glorify. There was desire, certainly, feels, and urgency, but also conversation, consent, stops and starts, a tenderness neither of us mocked by pretending not to need it. At one point, when I tensed out of old reflex rather than present fear, feels, he stopped immediately and looked at me with the whole of his attention. Feels. We don't do anything your body hasn't agreed to, he said. That sentence may be one of the most important I have ever heard. Because healing does not come from being pushed toward what should be good for you. Heals. It comes from having your autonomy returned so consistently that your nervous system starts to believe it. Later, when we lay quiet and the city glowed outside like another planet, I rested my head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat slow. Heals. His fingers moved through my hair once or twice without apparent awareness. I chose to stay, I said into the darkness, not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to be here. His arm tightened around me slightly. No speech. Heals. No grand declaration. Just pressure, just presence. That was enough. For that night, it was more than enough. The next week should have been simpler. Gregor was out of protection. The truce was in place. My documents were being replaced. Heals, a therapist named Dr. Heals. Levin began seeing me twice a week in a discreet office near the river, and for the first time someone explained trauma responses to me without pity, hypervigilance, dissociation, shame as adaptation. She said something that stayed. Heals. What was done to you was dehumanizing. Recovery is not about becoming fearless. It is about becoming a person to yourself again. I clung to that sentence. Ronan made room for those appointments without comment. Cillian drove me if Soraya couldn't. Feels. Declan helped me open a new bank account under tighter controls. Life was beginning to look less like hiding and more like rebuilding. Then the past reached back in a way none of us expected. It started with a box of my mother's things. Heals. Not because I went looking for mystery, because one of Gregor's former landlords, trying to avoid trouble after word of his disappearance spread, Heals, contacted the law office handling my address change and said there was an old storage locker still in my mother's name. Heals. My mother had died when I was 9. Officially, a bad infection that turned into organ failure because care was delayed. Gregor always said hospitals had been too slow. By then I knew enough to re-examine every story he had ever told me. Heals. The box itself was disappointingly ordinary. Receipts, a scarf, 2 photographs, a cheap necklace, an envelope, a cheap necklace, and 1 studio portrait of my mother standing beside a man who was definitely not Gregor. Heals. The first thing I noticed was that she looked younger than I remembered her. The second was the expression on her face, not fear, not resignation, joy small and private. The man beside her had one hand on the back of the chair she sat in, heels, not touching her but near enough to suggest intimacy. On the back of the photo was a date from the year before I was born and a short line in blue ink. For Lena in the life we haven't met yet. My chest went cold, heels, not because the photo proved anything immediately, heels, because it proved there had been an entire chapter of my mother's life Gregor had erased. When I brought the photograph to Ronan, he did not try to solve it with one dramatic theory, heels. He called in someone quiet and competent from Declan's side of the operation. A woman named Maeve who specialized in private tracing, records, births, employment histories, hidden debts. Slow answers, she told me when she took the photo, heels, but probably true ones. The phrase slow answers felt almost sacred. Too much of my life had been built on fast lies, heels. If there is one thing people underestimate about surviving abuse, it is how destabilizing freedom can be. During the first month in Ronan's world, nobody hit me, nobody screamed at me, heels. Nobody broke plates or watched the clock to control when I came and went. I had food, locks, therapy, a friend with the keys to the building, a man who could have dominated every room I entered, and instead kept asking, in different ways, heels, whether I wanted to be in it. And still there were mornings I woke with panic in my throat for no immediate reason. Still there were nights I startled when the elevator sounded, even though no one entered without approval. Safety, I learned, heels, is not just the absence of danger. It is a capacity the body relearns slowly. Ronan understood better than I expected. Some of it came from his own history. Some, I think, heels, came from the fact that his entire life had trained him to see what people concealed. He began changing small things in ways I almost missed, heels. He texted before coming to the apartment if he was late and knew I might be waiting. If a meeting would move us from one part of the building to another, he told me beforehand. Once, when Cillian had to bring in two unfamiliar men for a security review, heels, Ronan made sure they passed while I was out with Soraya so I would not come back to strangers in the hall. None of those acts looked romantic on the surface. They looked logistical. But trauma taught me their meaning immediately. Predictability, heels. Information, respect, the opposite of coercion. That was when my feelings for him deepened from desire into something sturdier and more frightening. Not because he made me feel weak, because he made me feel considered, heels. Maeve's investigation moved in the background while life acquired a strange shape around us. I did not go back to the restaurant right away. Ronan would have supported whatever I chose, but Dr. Levin suggested a phased return, heels. Not because you're incapable, she told me, heels. Because your nervous system deserved gentleness. I started by meeting Soraya for lunches near the place, then by stepping inside before opening hours. The clatter of cutlery and hiss of coffee machines, once my refuge, now felt almost too loud, heels. Still, routine called to me. The ordinary world had texture I missed. People worrying about tips and rent and overcooked eggs. A place where conflict was someone forgetting Table 12's order, not a rival crew tracing financial leaks, heels. Ronan never mocked that attachment. Once, when I apologized for talking too long about the restaurant's new manager, he said, "Small things are how people build lives worth protecting, heels." I stared at him for a second because the sentence was wiser than anything I expected from a man who negotiated peace between criminal organizations. He noticed my expression and added dryly, "Declan says I'm occasionally educable." "Occasionally, heels?" I asked. "Heels. Don't get ambitious," he said, and for the first time I saw a full smile on him, brief. Transforming, gone almost instantly. Cillian saw it too and looked so mildly alarmed that I laughed into my coffee. Those were good days, heels. Though good in the honest sense, not the storybook one. Good because they held therapy and paperwork and meals and difficult conversations. Good because no one asked me to forget where I had come from, heels. Good because Ronan and I were learning each other in the least cinematic ways possible. How he liked silence while reading reports. How he slept on his right side unless a nightmare had found him, then on his back with one hand fisted in the sheet, heels. How he trusted good knives, clean financial ledgers, and very few people. How I needed lamps on in corners at dusk because dark rooms still reminded me of waiting for Gregor's key in the lock. How sarcasm was my first defense and exhaustion my second, heels. Sometimes at night we lay together and talked about things that had nothing to do with our tragedies. Books, music, buildings in the city we liked or hated. Whether a person could ever leave their first language of survival completely behind. Heals. He told me about growing up in a family where loyalty was oxygen and weakness was a luxury no one admitted wanting. He had gone to private schools, then university for exactly a year before his father pulled him deeper into the machinery. Heals. Did you want out? I asked once. He thought for a long time before answering. I wanted choice. It's not the same thing. That too stayed with me. Choice, the thing abuse steals, the thing criminal systems also erode, the thing respect restores. Heals. Maeve came back 6 weeks after taking my mother's photo. She sat in Declan's office with a slim file and the expression professionals wear when they know facts are about to rearrange a life. The man in the photograph was named Daniel Varga, Heals, Hungarian by birth. Heals. Structural engineer. He and my mother had lived together for almost a year before he left Chicago abruptly. There had been no public marriage, no registered paternity. But there were letters, Heals. Employment records placing him in the city up to 4 months before I was born. A hospital form never completed, with my mother handwriting beginning his name in the space marked father before crossing it out. Heals. We can't prove biological relationship from paper alone, Maeve said carefully. But there is enough here to say Gregor may not have been your biological father. I felt oddly detached at first. Heals. As if the revelation belonged to someone else and I was just holding it temporarily. Then I asked the question already burning through me. Why would my mother cross the name out? Maeve and Declan exchanged a glance. Possibilities, Declan said. Heals. Fear, pressure, money, immigration status, violence. But I knew, not factually, in my bones. Heals. Gregor had not merely raised me badly. He had likely inserted himself into a life that was not his, then used control and fear to erase the truth. Rage came late, but when it came, it was volcanic. Not the frantic fear he usually inspired, something cleaner. Heals. Colder. He had stolen more than safety. He had stolen narrative, identity. My right to know who loved my mother before she died. My right to know whether some other life had been possible. Heals. Ronan found me in the upper floor library holding one of Daniel's letters so tightly the paper bent. Say something, I told him before he could. Anything. He came close, slow enough for me to step back if I wanted. What was done to you was theft, he said. Heals. Not fate. Not bad luck. Theft. Sat down because my knees had gone unreliable. I don't even know what I'm angry about first. You don't have to choose, I laughed once, roughly. That's not how people work. No, he said, taking the chair opposite me. Heals. But it is how storms work. Heals. I looked at him over the edge of the letter. You get poetic at the strangest times. I'm trying not to say I'll burn the city down, he said dryly. Therapy would disapprove. Despite everything, a sound like a laugh escaped me. Then I cried. Heals. Harder than I had cried when he first told me Gregor was Mafia, because this grief was older. It reached backward into childhood and touched every memory that might have belonged partly to a lie. Ronan came around the desk and crouched in front of me, Heals, not touching me until I nodded. Then he placed one hand over mine and let me break without trying to arrange the pieces. There is great dignity in being witnessed without being managed. It is one of the reasons I began to love him beyond excuse. Heals. The question became whether to pursue proof, DNA, records, the possibility that Daniel Varga was still alive somewhere. Dr. Levin warned me not to confuse answers with peace. Truth helps, she said, but it doesn't automatically heal. Heals. Sometimes it just gives pain the correct name. Still, I wanted the name. Not because I needed a fantasy father to replace Gregor. I didn't. I was old enough to know biology does not rescue a childhood. But truth matters. Heals. Human beings deserve to know their own story. Ronan supported the search, though he was careful not to turn it into a mission on my behalf that would swallow my life whole. We look, he said. We don't let it devour you. Heals. That same week, the first real threat arrived. Not from Gregor directly, from the instability he had left behind. A man connected to one of the third parties he had sold information to try to make contact through the restaurant, Heals. Asking staff questions about me, pretending to be a debt collector. Soraya called me immediately, then called Ronan before I could say don't. By the time I reached the building, Heals, Cillian had already increased visible security, and Ronan was waiting in the apartment, very still, very quiet. What happened? I asked. Heals. He handed me a photo taken from a distance, the man outside the restaurant. He won't come back, Ronan said. What did you do? Warned him, meaning he understood. I looked at him for a long moment. I don't want people hurt because of me. Heals. His expression changed, just enough to show he had expected that. No one was hurt because of you, he said. Someone was prevented from harming you. That's not always the same thing. No, he admitted. It isn't, Heels. We sat with that tension for a while because it was real and deserved room. Loving someone from a violent world does not become healthy simply because his violence is pointed elsewhere. Ethics remain. Fear remains. The need for boundaries remains. Heels. That night I told him plainly what I could and could not live with. No lies to me about actions taken in my name. No using my history as justification for cruelty that served ego instead of protection. Heels. No solving my fear by making me dependent on his power alone. Heels. He listened with complete seriousness. I can't promise you a spotless world, he said. I can promise honesty. And I can promise that if staying here ever starts costing more of you than it gives, I'll help you leave whole. Heels. It might have been the most loving thing anyone had ever said to me. Because real love does not ask you to disappear inside it. It protects your ability to choose even when the choice might not favor the person offering it. Heels. Eventually, Maeve found Daniel Varga in Milwaukee, alive, recently widowed. One adult son from a later marriage. No criminal record, stable career. The news stunned me into silence. A real person, not a ghost, not a fantasy. Heels. We sat with the file between us for an hour before I decided I wanted a letter sent. Not by Rona's people directly. Through Declan's office, framed carefully, giving Daniel the option not to respond. Why not just go see him? Heels. Soraya asked when I told her. Because I'm not a dramatic reveal in someone else's life, I said. Heels. And because I've had enough people force entry into my story. She squeezed my hand. That was annoyingly wise. I'm seeing a therapist. Tragic, she said. There goes your charm. Daniel wrote back 11 days later. The letter was short. Heels. He had loved my mother. He had been pressured to leave Chicago after what he believed was a debt issue involving a man she had become involved with after they split. He never knew she was pregnant. If there was any chance I might be his daughter, Heels, and if I wanted contact, he would do whatever felt respectful. I read the letter 3 times, then handed it to Ronan. He read it in silence and gave it back. Whatever you choose, he said. We build the rest around it. Build the rest around it. Again, Heels. Not romance. Structure. Respect. A future's described as something adjustable to my needs rather than dictated by his. I met Daniel 2 months later in a quiet law office conference room because neutral ground mattered. Ronan did not attend. Heels. Cillian stayed downstairs only because security insisted, and I had stopped fighting certain practical realities. Daniel was older than the photo, of course. Gray at the temples, careful hands. The same eyes as mine, Heels, which ended the matter before the test results arrived a week later to confirm it. He cried when he realized. So did I, though what I felt was not simple reunion, more like mourning for every year that had not happened. We began slowly. Coffee, Heels, questions, documents, stories of my mother before I knew her. He told me she loved old bridges and took photos of laundry lines because she said they proved ordinary life was worth recording. I told him she had hummed when she cooked, Heels, though I could no longer remember the tune. Truth did not erase Gregor. It did not save my childhood, but it gave me lineage without fear in it, and that changed something fundamental. Heels. It is hard to overstate the power of learning that violence was not the only inheritance available to you. Heels. By autumn, the city had changed color, and so had I, not into someone new, into someone more visible to herself. Heels. I had moved out of the 7th floor apartment and into a place 3 neighborhoods over that Ronan helped me buy through a legal shell, and then transfer entirely into my name once the paperwork was clean. It was small, sunny in the mornings. Heels. On a street with a bakery downstairs and terrible parking. Mine. That was the miracle. Not that he could have kept me in his tower and didn't. That he understood why ownership mattered to me more than access. Heels. No one should have to heal in a room they can be asked to leave, he said, when we signed the last set of papers. I looked at him over the conference table and knew there were still men in this world capable of building cages out of love. He was trying, Heels, imperfectly and sometimes against his own instincts, to build doors instead. Heels. I returned to work part-time first, then almost full-time, except now I was taking classes 2 mornings a week in hospitality management because Soraya and I had started talking about opening a cafe someday. Heels. Not a fantasy cafe with poetic nonsense on the walls. A real one, good coffee, warm soup in winter, decent wages if we could manage it. A place with enough light that no one would feel hidden there unless they wanted to. Heels. Daniel helped with business projections because engineers apparently have opinions about foot traffic. Ronan read the lease options I sent him and made notes in the margins like an overeducated threat in a tailored coat. Heels. Cillian claimed not to care and then quietly sent me information about a supplier who overcharged small businesses. How did you get this? I asked. I have hobbies, he said. You have surveillance. Broadly. Heels. Soraya rolled her eyes so hard it became a medical event. Heels. Gregor's end, when it came, was smaller than the fear he had once carried in my life. He was found 3 states away under another name, Heels, beaten badly after trying to extort money from the wrong intermediary who knew exactly what his betrayal had cost the Zakharovs. He survived long enough to be arrested on unrelated charges, Heels. By then, Declan had worked with the domestic violence advocate and state prosecutors to assemble enough evidence from hospital records, old photographs, neighbor statements, and my testimony that charges were added. The process was ugly, Heels. Court always is. There is nothing elegant about telling strangers what happened in your kitchen. Nothing satisfying about watching a man who broke your childhood sit in a suit, pretending he does not understand language like coercion and assault, Heels. But there was a moment during cross-examination when Gregor looked at me the way he always had, expecting me to shrink, to confuse fear with obedience. And I didn't. I answered clearly. Heels. I took up space. I said no when I did not know an answer and yes when I did. And for the first time in my life, his face showed not anger, but irrelevance. The court gave him time, not enough to equal what he took, because no sentence can do that, Heels, but enough to mark the record correctly, enough to tell the truth in public. After the hearing on the courthouse steps, Heels. Reporters shouted questions because organized crime had a way of attracting cameras even when domestic violence should have been the real story. I ignored them. So did Ronan, who had come only because I asked, Heels, standing 3 feet away in a dark coat like contained weather. When we reached the car, I stopped. You know the worst part, I said. It wasn't even the hitting, he waited. It was how often I thought I deserved it, or caused it, Heels, or failed to stop it by being better. His jaw tightened. That was the design, he said. That's what those men do. They train the victim to carry the blame so they can keep the power. Heels. I leaned against the car and looked at the sky over the courthouse. I want to do something with that. With what? With surviving it. I don't want it to become just the worst thing that happened to me. I want it to become useful somehow. Heels. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then we make it useful, slowly, quietly. Through the cafe first, Heels. When it opened a year later with mismatched chairs we chose on purpose, and a bulletin board near the register for local resources, shelters, counseling, legal aid, food support, language classes, through hiring practices, Heels. Through giving 2 women referred by the advocacy network their first stable jobs in months. No invasive questions asked. Through funding, anonymously at first, emergency hotel nights for people waiting on shelter placement, Heels. Ronan never put his name on any of it. This should not be charity as image repair, he said. Then what is it? I asked. Infrastructure, he replied. People survive on infrastructure. Heels. He was right. Grand gestures rescue headlines. Systems rescue lives. That became one of the quiet philosophies of our relationship. Love, too, is infrastructure when done well. Not possession. Not intensity for its own sake. Heels. A set of repeated conditions under which another person can safely remain themselves. Ronan and I never pretended our differences vanished. He remained a man with shadows around him. Choices I would never wholly approve. Heels. Responsibilities I did not envy, and a world I kept 1 foot outside of on purpose. He never asked for more than I could give. There were nights he came to my apartment after long meetings and stood at my kitchen sink in shirt sleeves, Heels, looking tired in the way only powerful men do when they have spent a day making decisions that leave no one clean. On those nights, we did not talk strategy. We talked tomatoes for the cafe menu, Heels. Daniel's latest awkward attempt to parent an adult daughter. Soraya's love life, which had become a rotating disaster, Heels. My classes, his insomnia. Once, while I washed mugs and he dried them with an absurd seriousness that made me smile, I asked, "Do you ever wish you'd met me somewhere ordinary?" He set down the towel and thought about it. "No," he said finally, Heels. "I wish the harm hadn't happened. I don't wish the meeting away. That's disturbingly well phrased. I'm evolving. Don't overdo it." He smiled, terrified I might. In time, touch became easier for him, though never casual. Heels. He still hated crowded rooms where strangers brushed against him unexpectedly. He still went very still sometimes if old grief took him by surprise. I still had nights when a sound from the hall turned my pulse wild. We did not cure each other. Feels. That is not what healthy love is. We accompanied. We adjusted. We learned the map of each other's triggers and did not weaponize them. We apologized when we failed. We made practical plans. We kept separate keys and shared routines. Feels. We built, in other words, something less dazzling and far more rare, mutual respect with teeth in it. Years later, if people asked how I ended up with a man like Ronan Morgan, I never told the short version. I did not say he saved me and I fell in love. Feels. That version flatters power too much and womanhood too little. The truth is more valuable. I was a woman escaping abuse who ran into a man with his own graveyard inside him. He had the means to shelter me and, more importantly, feels, the discipline not to turn shelter into ownership. I had enough instinct left to recognize the difference between fear and reverence, between protection and control, though it took time to trust that recognition. We met in violence, yes, feels, but we did not build our life out of violence. We built it out of boundaries, honest language, witness, therapy, paperwork, laughter, business plans, public truth, private gentleness, feels, and the stubborn belief that a person is more than the worst thing done to them, feels. If there is any lesson in our story worth carrying, it is not that a dangerous man can become soft for the right woman. It is something harder and more useful. That respect is the beginning of love, not its reward, feels. That survival is not the same as healing, but it can lead there if supported by truth. That no amount of trauma gives anyone the right to dehumanize another person, feels. And that sometimes the most radical thing two wounded people can do is not rescue each other from the world, but refuse to repeat the world's brutality inside the room they share. On the anniversary of the cafe opening, feels, Soraya hung a small framed card near the resource board. She made me read it before customers came in. It said, "Everyone who walks through this door deserves warmth, dignity, and the chance to begin again." Too sentimental, she asked, feels. I looked around the room at the morning light, at the students with laptops, feels. At the woman from the shelter laughing softly with a coworker near the espresso machine. At Daniel in the corner, pretending not to supervise our shelf installation. At Cillian outside in a car that he swore was not surveillance, feels. At Ronan standing near the pastry case in a dark coat, impossible and real, holding coffee for me the way he had once held space. "No," I said, "just accurate." Then I crossed the room, took the cup from his hand, feels, and kissed him in daylight with everyone watching. Years earlier, I had asked a stranger to hold me for 1 second on a cold Chicago street because I had nowhere else to put my fear. I know now that the second itself was not the miracle, feels. The miracle was everything that followed because two people, in very different ways, chose not to confuse love with power over another human being. In the end, that is what changed my life. Not the car, not the penthouse, not the truce between rival men, feels, respect, choice, truth, feels, the ordinary radical foundations of being fully seen and left free.